Never house sitting again. My boyfriend and I were house sitting for his aunt. She was heading off to Spain for her 60th birthday, having a girls' holiday, and asked us to stay over and look at her poodle Lucy, water the plants, sort the mail out, etc. We were both pretty happy to house sit, as it was massive, 4 bedrooms with a large living room. Arriving, we noticed that the fridge was stocked full, and we cracked open a beer while ordering pizza. Anyways, the hours go by and I'm starting to get tired. My boyfriend Danny isn't tired yet and wants to stay up and watch the football highlights. Fine, I'll go to bed myself. I wake up, not sure what time it is or how long I've been asleep for, but I can feel Danny in bed with me. I was quite annoyed at myself for going to bed early, because now I'm awake in the middle of the night and will have to wait until the early morning to go back to sleep. Plus, everyone knows that early morning TV sucks. I'm laying in bed facing the wall, eyes closed, trying to will myself to go to sleep, when I notice that Danny is freezing. He's pushed himself up right against me in an attempt to steal my body heat or warm up. With me not being able to sleep and a freezing body pressed up against me, I thought the best thing was to go back downstairs, grab a beer, and watch some TV. I get out of bed and glare over at Danny. I say, "Now what you're gonna do?" to the Danny-sized lump in bed while smiling to myself that he's going to be freezing in bed, without me, while I'm going to be nice and warm downstairs. Now, the way the house was set up, you had to go into the kitchen first and then go into the living room. I stopped along the way and grabbed a cold beer. Walking into the living room, I swear, my legs almost gave way, and I dropped the beer. Danny was sat out watching TV, greeting me with, "That for me?" while reaching his arm out. He couldn't have gone back into the living room without walking past me in the kitchen. I blurted out what I saw and felt. In a second, he's now standing up and saying, "Someone must know Aunt Kathy is away and snuck in thinking the house is free." We both ascend the stairs. The lights are still out in the bedroom. The lump in the bed is still there. It's not moving. I'm trying not to scream and covering my mouth with my hands. In one quick move, Danny grabs the bed cover and pulls it open. I swear to you, nothing was there. It was just an empty space. We ran our hands over where it had been laying, and it was freezing cold and wet. We later found Lucy curled up under the bed, with her tail between her legs and shaking. We had to use her treats to get her out. That was the scariest thing I saw while I was there. That and Aunt Kathy's holiday bikini photos. Manipulative entities and whispers in the woods. Around 2007, I was dating this guy and would spend days at a time at his house, mostly getting stoned and watching movies in the basement. He had told me in passing his house was haunted when we started dating, and I eventually got to hear for myself what he was talking about. When he said, it seemed like there were things playing games with voices and general sound projection. The most common thing would be when we were sitting on one side of the house alone, and would all of a sudden sound like the television was turned on to the highest volume on the other side of the house. Always a man and a woman having a loud, yet indistinguishable conversation with each other. And when you walked through the house down the hall towards the noise, by the time you got to the door and touched the door handle to open it, his dad's empty room, since he was gone for a week or so at a time, the noises would stop abruptly. Nobody would be inside, no appliances would be plugged in, no windows open, just nothing. Then, when you walk back towards the other side of the house, it would be a faint, but you hear the man and the woman continuing their conversation in the room you were previously sitting in, and that would happen back and forth throughout the house until you left pretty much. That happened to me a handful of times, and it happened to him apparently for years. One time, we were in the basement, laying on the floor falling asleep. At exact same moment, we both jumped up at the sound of things in the next room crashing loudly. The basement was a one-bedroom apartment. We were in the living room part of it, and it sounded like pots and pans were toppling onto the kitchen floor, like lots of them. It was really loud, and it was such an abrupt and intense moment that I almost started crying because of how startled I was. Then the sound stopped, and we both heard the skittering noise. That sounded like a bunch of dogs on the kitchen floor. Then a door slammed. It sounded like the bathroom door on the other side of the basement kitchen. He had one dog, a corgi, but it never went down into the basement. I made him get up and open the door, and nothing was amiss. No pots or anything on the floor, nothing. The bathroom door was closed, but we opened it, and there was nothing inside, or nothing that could have gone through the painted shut tiny window. The last thing about this same house I was not here for, but apparently he was down in the basement watching a movie, and he heard the upstairs door leading downstairs creak open slowly. Then the steps leading down began to creak even slower, and he assumed it was his dad trying to scare him, something his dad had done before, so he positioned himself at the door, ready to open it when his dad hit the last step to counter-surprise him. When he did this, the door upstairs shot open at the exact same time, and they both jumped out as if they were trying to scare one another. Apparently, his dad heard the basement door open and heard him creeping up the stairs, and neither of them could explain how the other could hear the same noise, but projected differently to one another. As for the whisper in the woods, this happened to me when I was little, probably no more than 6 or 7 years old. My dad had bought a shack in the woods of Pennsylvania to flip. I'm not sure where exactly at the moment, but the property was extremely secluded, and we did not have another neighbor for at least 3 to 4 miles. There was snowfall. It may have been starting to become a blizzard. I was walking up and down a really long driveway, running parallel to the woods, and I heard someone in really thick brush not far from me say, "Psst." It was loud enough to stop me and startle me, and I stared at it for a few seconds, not really sure what to do, I guess. Then I heard it again, in the exact way. Psst. It repeated this a few more times while I stood there, not moving and really freaked out. I remember I felt like I was about to pee myself because I was really terrified. Then I finally added, "Come here," in a really loud whisper, followed by another psst. At that time, I booked it down the driveway, and I could still hear it saying, "Psst, come here," in the exact same tone, over and over again. The way it spoke didn't seem natural. When I think about it now, it sounded almost like a weird recording of some kind. May or may not be paranormal, but I've always considered it as such. Piano played in empty house. Last week, I was house sitting for my mother while she was on a cruise, and I could hear the piano being played from down the hall. It was just a single note being played, but I heard it several times over the course of an hour. I thought it was just the factory behind the house, but the dogs heard it too and kind of cowered under the blankets after hearing it. It is an electric piano, and also pressure sensitive, so if a key was lightly pressed, it would not have been able to hear it 40 feet away. Any explanation? Also unrelated, but on a separate night, I was walking the dogs at around 11 p.m. and started to take them behind the house. When I got to the side of the house, I saw 2 snow-white figures stumble into the woods behind the house. They were far too big to be an animal and moved like a bag blowing in the wind. Any ideas as to what it could have been? Why I hate my grandmother-in-law's house. Last year in 2013, my husband and I had our first child. Because my husband is in the military and was leaving for a deployment 2 weeks after finding out I was pregnant, he decided it would be best if I went back home to Tennessee. We lived in Florida at the time for the duration of the deployment, and it was decided that I would stay at his grandmother's house since she had a fully furnished extra room I could sleep in. Now, the entire 9 months of my pregnancy were pretty normal. Sometimes I get a creepy feeling, or think I saw shadows in my peripheral vision, but I am naturally a paranoid person, so I assumed I was freaking myself out as usual, so I never mentioned it to anyone. Coincidentally, my husband got home from deployment less than 24 hours before my son was born via emergency C-section, a full 4 weeks before his due date. Despite being early, my son was very healthy, just on the small side, so we were home at his grandmother's house within a few days. Now, because my son was so small at the time, he basically had to wear preemie clothes, which still swamped him, to be honest. And on the night we got home, I had him make a quick run to Walmart for some more preemie outfits for my son. As soon as he left, I fed my son and put him to sleep inside our room, and came back out to the living area to enjoy some alone time, as his grandmother was out of the house the evening. Since I had a C-section, my movements at the time, honestly, were very slow and stiff, and the entire process itself took quite a bit of time and energy, and I had no intention of moving around too much again until my husband returned, and I was actually afraid to be alone, because it was so difficult for me to perform certain tasks. Now would be a good time to note that my husband and I owned a very large hybrid cat that I brought along with me from Florida. His name was Nova, and he was large, muscular, 24 pounds hybrid between a bobcat and feral house cat, whom we found as a small kid in the brush. Despite his breed and size now, he was actually a very protective and very friendly animal, and loved my son to pieces, and never left his side from the moment we had brought him home earlier that day. When I put my son to sleep, Nova had actually stretched out alongside him and fallen asleep as well. So when I heard a sudden hiss and yell come from the room, I was terrified, thinking that Nova had suddenly become aggressive towards our son. As I threw open the door to the room, I noticed that Nova was standing over our son, who was still uninterrupted, sound asleep, and had his back arched, and was hissing at the far corner of the room. My first thought was that perhaps I accidentally shut one of my husband's grandmother's dogs in the room with them or something, but at the moment I could see no animals, nor anything else out of the ordinary inside the room. The only thing in that corner of the room was my son's bassinet, which was over 70 years old, as it had been my husband's grandmother's as a baby. And Nova was staring straight at it, making the most god-awful noise you could imagine. His growl sounded like it could shake the entire room. God damn it, the entire house. Suddenly, he began to swipe at something that I couldn't see, and the room suddenly felt extremely volatile. I was terrified and grabbed my son from beneath Nova, and as soon as my son was pulled away from him, Nova retreated to the doorway, and as I slammed the door shut, I reached to lock it, only to find that it had already locked itself. I cowered with my son in the living room until my husband returned, Nova sitting at my feet, his eyes darting, trained on the doorway, and the hair along his back raised up high. Now, when my husband finally returned, I practically ran to meet him at the door, and when he caught sight of me, his eyes went wide, and he ran to ask me if I was okay, and began to lift my dress. At first, I was confused as to what he was doing, until I realized that my stomach, private area, and legs were coated in blood, and had soaked through the material of my dress. In my haste and fright during the experience, I managed to tear open 2 of the staples in the center of my incision. As I tried to tell him what happened, his first thought was that maybe I was reading too much into it, and that Nova was simply been having a moment, you know? He is a wild animal, right? But as my husband laughed off my story, he unlocked the door to our room and attempted to open it, only to have the door forcibly yanked from his grip and slammed shut and locked again. At this point, my husband paled, turned his head to me, and I could only ask if he still thought I was overreacting. At that moment, he tried again, with the same exact result. As he turned to walk away, the door audibly unlocked and cracked open, which sent Nova into a frenzy of hissing and yowling, as his eyes became trained on a spot halfway up the door. All of a sudden, the door flew open with such force that the knob left a mark in the wall behind it, and a cold blast of air exuded from the room. My husband and I were terrified and were seconds away from bolting out of the house with our son in hand. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The house was eerily calm, and there was no longer a feeling of intense foreboding. Only seconds later, his grandmother walked through the door, oblivious to the terror that had just taken place inside her home. Oddly enough, my son never woke once, or even stirred during this entire experience. But even though this was his first brush with the paranormal, it was far from his, or me, or my husband's last. More tales will follow soon.